Good afternoon. We're just going to take a couple seconds to give people time to log on. Thank you for joining us. I will be starting in about 30 seconds, giving people time to log on. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Bowen, and I am the Director for Library Programming and Public Affairs. On behalf of the Pepperdine Libraries, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion on Dr. Jason Blakely's new book, We Built Reality: How Social Science Infiltrated Culture, Politics, and Power. After I introduce today's speakers, Dr. Blakely will give a brief summary of his book, and then the panelists will offer remarks. That will follow with a more informal style discussion, at which time the audience may ask questions via the chat box. Be sure to stay to the end, because we will be sharing a link for you to sign up for your chance to win one of 2 autographed copies of the book. But before we start, I did want to mention 2 upcoming virtual events hosted by the libraries. On Thursday, March 11th at 3 p.m., we are pleased to host a virtual talk by Brenda E. Stevenson, who is professor and Nicholl Family Endowed Chair in History at UCLA, for the second installment of our Larry Donald Kimmons Memorial Lecture Series. Dr. Stevenson will speak about the racial uprisings in Los Angeles at the time of the Kimmons murder. Then on Thursday, March 25th at 3 p.m., Melissa Nikkanen, Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and University Archives, will give a virtual tour of our historic Bibles. You can learn more about these and other upcoming events at library.pepperdine.edu. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Michael A. Helfand is Professor of Law and Vice Dean for Faculty and Research at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law, as well as Interim Director of Caruso Law's Newt Barr Institute for Law, Religion, and Ethics. In addition, he is currently serving as visiting professor and Oscar M. Rubenhauser Distinguished Fellow at Yale Law School, as well as Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Samuel D. Rocha is Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, specializing in philosophy of education. His most recent book is The Syllabus as Curriculum, a reconceptualist approach. And our guest of honor, Jason Blakely, is an associate professor of political science at Pepperdine University and the author of, most recently, of We Built Reality: How Social Science Infiltrated Culture, Politics, and Power. He is also a senior fellow at the Nova Forum at the University of Southern California. Dr. Blakely, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and I want to thank Pepperdine Libraries for organizing this event. I'm honored, and Michael, and also Sam, who are friends and also really great intellects, for agreeing to read and come on and comment on my book. I wanted to just give a very brief overview of what the book is about for those of you who have not read it. So there'd be a shared point of reference in our discussion, and I do hope you all have a chance to jump in the chat if you have any questions at the end. But I wanted to quickly tell you guys a quick story about in my early 20s and a little seed of this book that occurred then. In my early 20s, which was around the early 2000s, I moved to New York City and I worked in the very famous bookstore, the Strand bookstore. It's a really well-known bookstore to book lovers. And I worked at a branch that's since gone defunct near Wall Street. At lunchtime, a bunch of people from Wall Street would flood in to look at the books and buy stuff. Well, at that time, Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner had just released their absolutely sensational bestseller, Freakonomics. Now, Stephen Levitt is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and Freakonomics promised to explain everything in economic terms. Levitt is a respected economist, but a lot of self-respecting economists said this doesn't really have anything to do with economy. This is kind of economy gone berserk. What I noticed, though, in my early 20s was that these iBankers and investment people were coming in and they were buying up the book like crazy. And I would talk to them about why they were buying the book. And what I noticed is they didn't just want to brush up on sort of the basics or a popularized version of neoclassical economics. They did want that. But more than that, they wanted to inhabit a world that looked more like what was described by a popularized version of neoclassical economics. And they themselves wanted to become more like neoclassical economics. And I thought that was very strange. So I'd like to give a very brief overview of my book. I'm going to throw some slides up. I don't usually do this, but I find it sort of helpful on Zoom. Just very brief, 10, 15 minutes. So Jeff, if you don't mind putting the slides up. We Built Reality starts from this paradox. While Jeff puts those up, it starts from this paradox. And the paradox is that we can, what appear to be just descriptive scientific theories, we can actually embody them more, we can become more like them. So I'm going to do this all too briefly to be persuasive, but just to give you a sense for what the book is about. Jeff, if you don't mind hitting the next slide. So the central thesis of the book, philosophically speaking, is that the social sciences have a unique word-object relationship. What do I mean by that? Well, in the natural sciences, the word, the theory developed by scientists, as it's articulated by people, does not necessarily affect the object out there. The Ptolemaic, system of physics doesn't change the positions of the planets, nor does the Copernican one when it replaces the Ptolemaic one. Yet in the social sciences, we have a situation in which the word, the theories, actually, in some sense, change the object out there. That's part of what's behind my anecdote of Freakonomics and these Wall Street guys who really wanted to be more like what they were reading in the theory. I call this in the book double H effects. Double H effects refers to double hermeneutic effects, which is a well-known term to philosophers. Hermeneutics is just this fancy term that means interpretation, the art of interpretation. If you like, one of the premises of my book is that in the social sciences, the interpretations we have of the world can enter into the self-understandings that people hold and change the world. That's why I have this painting up on this slide by the famous French surrealist René Magritte. You've got a man looking at himself, and then of course we're looking at the painting. So it's a painting about self-reflexivity, really brilliantly captured there by Magritte. But my point is that so often in social science theories, there's a feature that's world making. An example of that I think people are really familiar with is Marxism. In the 20th century, Marxism became the official ideology of several regimes across the world, most notably the Soviet Union. And along with that theory came a whole set of institutions, practices, beliefs. And so in a sense, you could look at the Soviet Union and see it as either a vulgarization, a distortion, or what Marxism becomes in fact. I mean, you could have the debate, but the point is that a world was made out of the theories. Now that's very strange, right? That makes the social sciences fundamentally different than the natural sciences. And in some sense, my book is an extended meditation on this problem. My book is an extended meditation on how, in the social sciences, we create or build worlds through our theories, and we don't simply describe a world out there. Okay, let me give a couple more examples, and then I'll open it up to the panelists. So the next slide shows the case of race. I begin the introduction with this example of racial theory. I think of racial theory, yes, as a pseudoscience. Most biologists, the consensus in biology is that race is not a natural type, the way that sort of on the street racist ideology holds, that the human race is kind of carved up into distinct types. That is not held to be a legitimate theory of biological science. But what interests me about it as a political theorist is that it's what racial theory is in a sense is a repressed set of meanings that we enact. A set of word descriptions about an object that then we enact in different ways. So a lot of people don't realize this, but Carl Linnaeus, the famous botanist who came up with the absolutely brilliant binomial system of naming species, And it's a way in which you can basically name all living things on the planet, right, through this binomial system through Latinate terms. A lot of people don't know that Linnaeus also divided Homo sapien, what he called Homo sapien, into subtypes. I think it's 4 subtypes, if I'm remembering correctly: white, Asiatic, African, and then American indigenous. Now, into those sub-natural types of race, he claimed that there were different distinguishing marks that tracked basically with a sort of racial hierarchy. So for the white race, which he located in Europe, he ascribed things like inventiveness. To the African race, it won't surprise people. You can hear that train coming on time down the tracks. Laziness, things like this. Now, as a political theorist, those are social categories, those are moral categories, and yet he was naturalizing them. Now, the interesting thing to me is the way that the description can become a world. So in the next slide, I'll just give a couple last examples of this before passing it over to my panelists. I want to be clear that I don't just think this is a way of talking that we have, okay? I think that the reason I have a go at popularized or vulgarized social science is because I think one of the weird things about the modern world is that we live superstitiously within our pseudoscientific theories. And so it's not just up here, it's not just something professors are talking about or debating about, it's not just something for intellectuals. I actually think it's a form of power, and even one of the principal forms of power in our society. That form of power I call technocracy in the book, by which I mean something like rule by experts, but I use it in a specific way to mean rule by those who claim to have a science of human behavior by which they can control and sort of model human behavior. Since I already got us going on the racial example, I've got tons of different examples of this in the book. I mean, I think there's technocracy behind our dating practices. I think there's technocracy behind the way in which the Iraq War was carried out. I think there's technocracy behind the way our democracy is run as a kind of managerialized democracy by experts. But 2 examples that I've already kind of got the ball rolling on are race and economics. And I do spend quite a bit of time on those in the book. So very briefly, we just went through a whole lot of social unrest in the country. And there are a lot of dimensions to that. And I don't mean to just reduce it to the social scientific dimension. But I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that the form of policing we have in the United States today is very influenced by the social theories that fed into it. So, for instance, in the book, I talk about broken windows theory. Broken windows was a social scientific theory that held that small crimes, like breaking windows with rocks, were correlated with big crimes, like assault, violence, battery, rape, etc. And so if you were very hard on the small crimes, you would suppress the big crimes. Now, the big question with this that I go into in the chapter is what counts descriptively as a small crime? I make the case that a lot of the small crimes that show up are racialized small crimes. Who jumps a turnstile in New York to get on the subway? That's a poor person's crime, right? In the United States, race and poverty correlate. So if you crack really hard on that small crime of jumping the turnstile, you're going to be cracking really hard on poorer, browner people, generally speaking. Now, a lot of my neighbors in West LA, they hire gardeners, they hire nannies on the side. That costs the state a lot more money than jumping the turnstile. That doesn't count as a broken windows effect. You don't have the SWAT team breaking in. You don't have people, putting people down in chokeholds because they did these things. And yet, poor person's crimes like selling Lucy cigarettes, et cetera. So I think a lot of people don't understand that there's a link between the intensity of policing and a certain sort of social scientific conception of what that policing is doing. I also go into examples of racial profiling, the reading of racial bodies, the way that a lot of times what people do today is they don't say being a certain race makes you criminal. Instead, they say being a certain race correlates with a bunch of different factors you can plug in statistically. And so I can kind of read your body shorthand to know what your propensity is toward crime. And so you have racial profiling as having a kind of technocratic pseudoscientific basis for it, right? You have stop and frisk, practices like stop and frisk as having mass incarceration as having a sort of technocratic basis to them. Okay, that's all too fast, but I want to give more time to our discussion. Last example, circle back to economics and to my neighbors and acquaintances who were coming into the bookstore and wanted to look more like Freakonomics. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how a vulgarization of neoclassical economics, I'm not saying straight neoclassical economics. A lot of my colleagues who are economists would say, look, these are just models, they don't describe the world, but a certain vision of human beings that economics offers as preference and interest maximizing has become a kind of self that we try to inhabit more or less. So if you think of someone like Ayn Rand, who was also very popular in the bookstore with my Wall Street customers, she says like greed is good essentially. Well, why is greed good for someone like Ayn Rand? Because they rely on a notion that, well, first of all, everyone is involved in preference or interest maximization, but also that there's inadvertently a kind of social benefit to everyone following self-interested economic behavior. This is what I refer to in the book as Homo Economicus, or economic man. That's Latin terms for economic man. Think about little adages that we have in our politics. Adages like, the government is always inefficient. If you ask someone, how do you know the government is always inefficient? You'll have to press them to ask them why it is that actors behave in certain ways in government situations where the incentives are lined up in one way versus in private sector situations where the incentives are lined up in another way. In other words, what you'll run up against is a certain popular science that says government is always inefficient, the private sector is always efficient, right? Now, I go into the book how I think that these don't stand up, but what I'm more trying to say is, as an initial claim, is that this description of the world, or this idealized model of the world that's sometimes taken on board by ordinary people as a description, then gets enacted and actually creates very much the political and social space we live in. Okay, I appreciate that that's fast and a lot, but I hope it gives you at least a sense for why the book is titled We Built Reality, and why I think that popularized social science has these kind of what I call vulgarization effects and double hermeneutic effects on our social life.
Wonderful. I believe I'm up next. Is that right? Great. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to first say a few words about why I consider the project of this book, and by project I mean in some sense the critique that this book takes up, as very important, and one that I would want to, in a sort of uncritical way, endorse. And then on the other hand, take up the back end of my time to gently and lightly critique, and maybe even critique the very critique that I'm going to endorse first by saying that it's not maybe critical enough. So there's a lot of C words there, and I apologize about my camera. But the reason why I think this book is so important today is there's kind of a, I think, more or less division of consensus between those who accept, you might say, facts as a kind of, as having truth value, and those who, this kind of like new skepticism of sorts that wants to say every fact is up for grabs. There's a kind of new kind of species of relativism involved. And I think that what can be missed is that in many cases, the facts that are on the table, whether they be statistically presented or through the veneer of a kind of scientific formula or invocation, that those facts don't necessarily, just because they can overperform fake news or, you know, this kind of relativistic thing, they don't necessarily actually always have the money to get behind the checks that they're trying to write within the public sphere. And so what I think this book does a really good job of is it shows us that the facticity of the social sciences is thoroughly questionable, and takes us maybe even deeper into an understanding of why perhaps we find ourselves in the situation we're in this kind of fake news, alternative facts universe we're living in. And I think that's important. I think the roots of it, though, go a good bit deeper perhaps than economics or political science. And I'm not here saying that the roots laid in the book are necessarily shallow. Within my field and within my kind of research area, educational research, the social sciences control about 90 to 95% of the territory. And this is the stuff that gets put into every school, regardless of where you come down on school choice or anything like that. Most private schools, religious schools, charter schools, every school is essentially relying on some social scientific, psychological understanding of even the very idea of education. And so I think this book can be, in some sense, energized by the fact that there's a lot more data out there to support the thesis. But I want to get into some of the early couching of the argument at the beginning and question whether or not the book is, in its present presentation of the critique, whether it can actually get us there. So the book kind of begins with two pretty large pivots. The first is pivoting away from the idea that this book is a critique of the natural sciences. He very clearly says, I'm not doing that. The second pivot is pivoting away from, quote, the social scientific debates of higher academe. In other words, you might say good social science. And what he ends up with is essentially popularized pseudoscience as his target. Well, I hope it's not ungenerous for me to say that that's a fairly deflated target to go after. If one wants to critique, you might say, the epistemological foundations of what I agree is this kind of overinflated social scientific paradigm. This is not exactly Kuhn's project. This is not exactly some of the skeptical critiques of science that we've seen. And I think that I'm sympathetic to the idea that it clearly wants to be communicated at a popular level, at a kind of ordinary everydayness that we can recognize and feel, and kind of what we're doing in our day-to-day lives as opposed to the academic ones. But I really do question whether both departures, one from the naturalistic idea of science, from the natural sciences, and then secondly, I think definitely the second one of letting all social science essentially that's good, or maybe it's just one's colleagues or whoever it is, kind of get away with all of this. I think that that's too quick a move, I would say. And one of the basic divisions whenever we look at this in the old kind of Prussian model of the university was the old Naturwissenschaft versus Geisteswissenschaft division between the sciences of nature and the human sciences. And I think that in many cases the social science that's being talked about is much less from that clearly distinguished sense of knowledge that puts a division between natural, objective, external reality on the one hand, and then culture, Bildung, where education comes in, and all these other things on the other, but really kind of is conflating and running around with them. And I think that this is a huge problem, and I'm glad that Jason is addressing it, making it real, and putting it into contact with probably the lowest hanging examples. But I think we need to go much further up the tree to look at some of those higher, perhaps, hanging examples and realize that they might suffer from the exact same toxic poisoning as the ones at the bottom, like Freakonomics. So my critique of the book would be that I think it's easy to critique Freakonomics, and it should be, because it's not just bad science, it's bad thinking. I know there's other work that Jason has done, and I know the advocacy for hermeneutics and the humanities. I see him reaching for his stuff over there across the screen. I would like to have the argument about what those cases are, because I do think we could make, and I'm running out of time here, distinctions between what are the best tools suited to this. And here, as a much more realist-oriented person in terms of phenomenology, I probably wouldn't turn to interpretation right out of hand. I'd probably grab something a little bit more positivistic, if I could say, though. But anyhow, I think the book is super important. I hope everyone reads it. I'm going to be assigning this book whenever I teach courses in social scientifically dominated education departments whenever I teach. And so I think it's well worthwhile, and it gets us started on a great conversation.
Well, if this turns into a battle with who's got more books in the background that they can grab, so Sam, we're in trouble because I'm pretty confident Jason's going to win that. I've got a big book over here, but it's just a dictionary. I don't think it's going to win the day. All right. just really a pleasure being here. Thank you, Pepperdine Libraries. Jason, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and be in conversation with you and Sam around this book. You know, it's in many ways just the perfect book for right now. I mean, right now, science dominates the news. And not just kind of any science, but dilemmas of public health. Thinking about how we take science and translate it in a way so that the public can understand it and act upon it effectively. I mean, that is really everything we're living through right now. And I think your book, like at its core, problematizes the idea of vulgarized or degraded science, really very much in keeping with what Sam just said. And what happens when you take vulgarized or degraded science, put it through the prism or the translation machine of social science, and then make it available to the public. You know, what happens? I take that to be kind of the big issue that you're trying to grapple with. And you know, as I've expressed to you before, you know, the book does vacillate between two versions of the problem. And I think Sam's comments touch on this also. And I want to say a little bit about the two versions of the problem that I see in the book. And then, you know, what that means for us in terms of if there are two different kinds of problems, what the solution for each different version of the problem is. And hopefully that'll make some sense in a few minutes. So I take the first version of the problem to be this kind of scientism, this social science kind of degrading of the natural sciences, that it doesn't work, meaning it lacks the predictive capacity that it claims to have. And you've got some chapters on this when you talk about 2008 and the recession, the way in which economics made predictions about how the world would work, and they didn't work. The predictions were wrong and people lost their shirts. The problem there is the failure in its predictive capacity, I think. You have another chapter where you talk a little bit about political scientists or pollsters and, you know, their views of human behavior and predictions they made on that basis. And that the problem was those methods of predicting didn't work. They didn't predict Brexit. They didn't predict Trump. It was a failure in their capacity to predict. And that's one version of the problem, that the degraded natural sciences through the prism of social sciences don't actually work. And that causes great harm. People don't know what's going to happen in politics, or they lose all their money. And these are big, big problems. Sometimes in the book, and I think, you know, so maybe more starting in the second section of the book, the problem that I see creeping in, and it's almost a response in a certain way to Sam's critique, because I think you believe more sometimes than you let on in the book. The problem there isn't, it sounds more like, even if it works, it's very bad. Even if it fulfills all its predictions, it's bad, and maybe it's worse if it works. And here, you know, I'm thinking of your chapters on things like, you know, artificial intelligence, dating. You know, when you talk about the way in which the social sciences have conceived of man as, I want to get this phrase right, neurobiological computational machines. We're just a bunch of inputs and outputs. You can predict how I will vote based on demographics. And in that way, I'm not anything more than just a function of my environment. There's nothing more to me. Or when you talk about things like questions of depression and the way in which that's biologized, the way in which we need to fix the inner workings of the human mind when they're askew, because we're machines that need fixing. And in those chapters, it often sounds like, even if the medicine, quote unquote, works in the way it's supposed to, even if you have accurately predicted how I will vote in some way or another, it's very bad to describe it in this way, because the way in which it reinforces certain tendencies that are bad for our humanity. To me, those are two very different kinds of problems. One is, on the one hand, it doesn't work and bad things, bad material things happen. The other is it might work, and that will destroy our humanity. We are more than that, and our ability to access the fact that we're more than that becomes increasingly problematic when we allow the social sciences to describe humans, people, in these terms. And, you know, I think about those two different versions of the problem when I think about kind of, the conclusion of the book is radically bold. I mean, you don't get as much of a sense of what's coming at the end throughout the book. It's kind of like you're waiting. I found myself personally reading the book. I'm like, this is terrible. This is awful. It's like a depressing book in a certain way, right? Like everything sucks. Maybe it's that way a very good book. And then at the end, I'm like, Jason, what should we do? Help us. And at the end of the book, you talk about, and I want to get these phrases right. You say that the solution to these problems, quote, involves other ways of knowing the world. And on this, you say, quote, one of the chief resources in this regard is the humanities, which I thought was like super interesting that, the humanities, and here it's very provocative, art, history, culture has ways of recovering other ways of being that can kind of push back against kind of the social scientification of the human experience. But to me, that solution makes sense if we're talking about the second problem, meaning even if it works, it's doing terrible things. And we need the humanities to remind us of our humanity. And therefore, even if social science works in this way, or degraded social science works, we still should resist it, or we at least need to recalibrate the way in which we use both social science language and humanities language and the like. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But it doesn't seem like the right answer to the first question, or the first version of the problem, which is the problem with social science is it doesn't work. Because the answer to it not working is we need more science. We need the kind of, as Sam was already alluding to, the non-degraded form of social science, or maybe more of the natural sciences. Humanities, doesn't help us make it work. It gives us an alternative form of accessing who we are and what we want to be. Obviously, I've been giving a lot of thought to that. And at the end of the book, you can see you start to grapple with some of these issues clearly coming up around public health, etc. Obviously, we're in a moment where the answer to the public health crisis doesn't feel like it's the humanity. Maybe it is actually on a certain level. Some of the problems that we've been dealing with on a certain level of, our willingness to think about our neighbor, questions of common good and decency in our behavior, maybe the humanities does have a lot to say over there. But, discarding the social sciences, the way in which we talk about public health, using the natural sciences, trying to model human behavior in a way around the natural sciences through the social sciences in order to, protect people, that feels like it's also got to be part of the solution to the first sort of problem, to make it work better, to make it have better predictive capacity. Obviously our infrastructure hasn't been fantastic around this pandemic, to say the least. And, it's certainly, the book gets me thinking that on the one hand, there's a piece of us that needs to access things like the humanities in order to push back against this scientism. On the other hand, maybe part of the solution is also doubling down on science in certain areas in order to also solve the first problem. In any event, that's what this got me thinking about. I cannot think about a book that's better attuned to the current moment, forcing us to grapple with, how we want to deal with human behavior and science, and what the limits of our knowledge are when kind of the very most important issues are at stake for society and civilization. So super grateful to have read the book. Thanks so much for writing it.
Thank you, guys. I think I have a few minutes, right, Jeffrey, to respond, and then we open it up broader. Is that correct? Yeah. Wow. I'm impossible to do justice to the comments, right? And thank you guys for so thoughtfully reading it and for thinking through it so carefully. And a mark of how carefully you've read it is I'm like jumping to, no, I need to clarify that point because, I have something to say about that, because both of you really touched on some central issues. Yeah, just maybe I'll start backwards to what Michael is saying. It sort of surprised me, the moment we're living in right now. It's quite acute, some of the issues that I discuss in the book that I had no idea what was going to happen in 2020. Obviously, I wrote the book in probably 2018 or 2019. One of those, of course, is the whole issue of public health and the crisis of scientific authority. You can't say anything that doesn't offend someone these days, so I just have to sally forth. I don't understand the anti-vax movement as a principled position. I think we should listen to scientists on vaccination. However, I will say this for the anti-vaxxers. When you have public policy being framed that says bars can be open, synagogues, mosques, and churches have to be closed, a lot of my liberal friends, a lot of my friends who are not religious, don't really understand why that, in some senses, erodes the expertise of the very people who can tell you about masking up and tell you about the vaccinations. So there's a lot of confusion about when am I speaking as an ordinary person and a citizen, and when am I speaking in the name of science? And so just to echo and underline what Michael is saying, absolutely. It is complete babble of tongues we're living through, and we're suffering because of it. We're suffering about what's reasonable authority and what's unreasonable authority right now. Really interesting point about the distinction between, is my issue with social science, and it goes into Sam's issues too, is my issue with that social science doesn't work, or is my issue that it's bad, or is it that both? And don't I kind of tack between the two? I say it in the book, but it goes by fast. I basically agree with what Sam is saying. What I'm basically against is a philosophy that's very dispersed, that you find in high academe and on the street, that philosophers refer to as naturalism. And I'm coming from, sorry for the $100 words, but from an interpretive or hermeneutic perspective. So there isn't a unitary social science. I basically hold that there is a distinction between the natural sciences and the social sciences that has to do with the object of study. Human beings are free creative agents. That's an assumption in my anthropology. We could get into debates. I haven't argued that. I'm just stating it right now. I did give somewhat of an argument for it, though, with the double H effect. The fact that there are double H effects is already a big problem for people who just want to say the human sciences are like the natural sciences. Now, one thing that's interesting is naturalism, or the view that you can model the social sciences on the natural sciences, is an extremely complex, diffuse worldview. It has really sophisticated variants, and it has really simplistic variants. And sometimes you have people who can straddle the two. That's what Stephen Levitt was able to do. No one's going to say the man doesn't know his economics. He sits on the faculty of the University of Chicago. He wrote respectable journal reviewed articles and so on. And then he wrote for economics, right? So there's already something, he's a formidable figure. I went at some of the top figures in social science, to Sam's point about low-hanging fruit. David Mayhew is the top congressional scholar in the country. Actually, Michael studied with him. I learned at Yale, so apologies. Apparently, he's a really nice guy. Cass Sunstein, I go after in the book. He's considered one of the top legal theorists in the country right now. Samuel Huntington. They made me read Samuel Huntington in Berkeley when I studied political scientist. He's one of the top political scientists in the country at Harvard before he died recently. Michael Doyle, considered to be the founding figure of modern democratic peace theory. I criticize his work. So Sam is very right to press me on this, because I'm being sort of coy in the book about the relationship here. The reason is because in the high variance, you got to be careful, because a lot of complex stuff is going on, some of which can be affirmed by an interpretivist like myself, some of which needs to be really criticized. And I could go into that more. But one of the primary doctrines of naturalism is that human beings are predictable the way brute objects are. That's mission impossible on my view, because humans are creative agents. So the two problems, it doesn't work. That's a descriptive claim, right? Like your explanations don't work is a descriptive problem. That explanation doesn't work for that object out there. You're not explaining the behavior of dolphin. You're not explaining why that rock fell, right? It's bad is a value claim. It's an ethical claim. It's a claim about that's bad for our humanity. And Michael rightly points out that I'm concerned with both. But as a hermeneuticist, I think that it's false to try to split those. I think you have to be careful. So in physics, you know that an object falls at whatever meters per second squared, I've forgotten just now. I can say that's really bad, and we could get into a conversation about theodicy and how I have beef with God, but it's kind of missing the point, isn't it? I mean, a description of the rate at which an object falls is just a factual description. But I want to say both, because the anthropological claim that human beings are self-interpreting, which I rest the entire analysis of the book upon, means that it comes with a sort of normative bent that if you try to treat them like just brute objects, yes, you're getting them descriptively wrong, but yes, then I also need some kind of a language about why it's ethically degrading, right? So the split there between it doesn't work and it's bad, to me, is a split that comes out of this diffuse worldview that Sam is kind of pressing me on, like, why aren't you harder on upper social science? And he saw me reaching for my book, because I've read another book, and the last thing anyone involved in this needs to do is read a second book by Jason Blakely. But I have a second book that is all about practicing highbrow and social scientists and the problems I have. Now, the reason I go out of my way to affirm social science is because there's so much in social science that's good and right that you can learn about the world. And where it goes wrong is at the level of explanation. I think you need narrative explanations, not law-like causal explanations. So, I mean, there's another book that's all about, like, I think you need non-value neutrality in the social sciences. Now, are there value neutral facts? Sam's really interesting point about facticity. Yes, there are actually in the social sciences. For instance, Boulder County, Colorado tends to vote Democrat. That's something from every ideology, we ought to be able to say that's a fact. We shouldn't be post-fact on that issue. And social scientists accumulate an enormous number of important facts for us. Where I usually take issue with my colleagues is at the level of explanation. When they start saying, I can correlate the fact that you're white or you're a woman with you'll vote Democrat, and I can neglect your beliefs and meanings and your culture and your story, then I do have a problem. Then I think that even high forms have slipped into pseudoscience. And so Sam is sort of right to press me on this. To put my cards on the table, I basically agree with the distinction that comes out of the old debates in German Romanticism and German hermeneutics about the human sciences versus the natural sciences. Okay, I feel like Socrates in Book One of the Republic, where he's like, I set out a banquet and then I ate through like a pig and I didn't enjoy any of it. And I got it all over myself. And not adequate answers. I don't know if one of you wants to come back at me or if we got questions from.
Well, I see there's a pause. Maybe Jeff will let us know if we've got some questions in the queue.
Yeah, I definitely want to play fair and nice.
I'm less interested in playing fair and nice. I like Jason that much. But Jason, what do you think about all the attempts to use social distancing and other forms of regulations in order to stem the tide of the virus, which are all predicated, I think, on the way in which humans will react to regulation and the desire to craft rules that are, oh, I see we've got Chris Soper asked something, which is going to be way better than anything I'm about to ask, but ways in which to take science, kind of run it through legal rules and to generate outcomes based on what we predict humans will do. There's something about that on your book feels like, I don't know, we're doing the wrong thing, or the better move would be, I don't want to be too ridiculous about this, but the better way to deal with this would be to give them more of the humanities. As opposed to kind of these rules.
Yeah.
That's where I start getting stuck.
I'm glad you brought that up, because another thing that I'm kind of coy about in the book, but not coy about in my other writings, is that why the humanities? Because the humanities can go wrong, by the way, in an infinite number of ways. In fact, naturalism can influence the humanities as well. This worldview that you need to explain human beings on the models of the natural sciences. So there's nothing that makes the humanities immune. I'm defending a particular philosophical vision of the humanities, and that's what that's shorthand for. Why the humanities? Because the humanities are the home, culturally and traditionally, of narrative disciplines that practice the art of interpretation. And that's what hermeneutics means. And that's the philosophical school I ascribe to, the art of interpreting. If someone comes to you and says, I've got this scientific explanation for why Hamlet takes so long to kill his father, you'll just say, you are a terrible reader of Shakespeare. But if someone says, I've got this scientific explanation for why this person voted for Trump, those people have the public square. And we just put people on mute. We don't listen to why. And this has a lot to do with the crisis electorally we have. We don't listen to why people voted for Trump. We don't listen to why people voted for Obama. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. There are spiritual reasons for that. There are ideological reasons. But I do think a major one is technocratic. We live a gamified politics. What do we learn on election night? I would submit that we learn nothing. And in fact, that we're badly formed on election night into this kind of gamified practice. To your point about epidemiologists, I have a piece in the Hedgehog Review because I felt so anxious about, I'm not the anti-science person, which is part of why Sam rightly sort of gets me on, like, why do you make these massive pivots? In part because my distress is that the overextension of scientific authority has undermined it. And my other distress is, as someone who belongs to different cultural and political and religious traditions, the kinds of wisdom that don't speak the language of science are canceled or put on mute, if you like. We don't listen anymore to other ways of knowing the world through literature, through the prophetic traditions. We don't listen to those. Now, the issue I have is, so I got sort of anxious when the pandemic happened. So I started thinking I need to pitch a story to someone. Someone please publish a piece on why I'm not just the anti-science guy. My issue with epidemiologists is we should make a distinction between when there is ordinary people contesting narratives, and public policy is always ultimately about narrative. It's about good and bad players. We have rival narratives in a democracy, good and bad players, what our values are, etc. I think we should listen to epidemiologists when they tell us things like, does double masking work? Does COVID spread mostly through aerosolized form or on surfaces? But I think epidemiologists, it's a democratizing move, are on the same ground as all of us. If the debate is, should we have bars open or mosques, churches, synagogues open? And unfortunately, I think there's a real confusion philosophically about that. And so the people who have a lot to teach us about the virus go unheard because they overreach, and they often don't know they're overreaching because they bought into naturalism. So they think they're just doing their job. When they do a utilitarian calculation of why a church gathering is worse than, an outdoor bar gathering or whatever it is. But I wish that my friends and neighbors would understand how inflammatory that can be to someone who doesn't feel like they're part of the political process or is heard. To be told, what matters most to you, which is to go to this evangelical church, you can't do that anymore. But you can go to this restaurant or bar. It sounds like what you're saying is money is more important than God to those people. So I think it's important to recognize when we're contesting stories, which we all have to practice the art of interpretation. No, I think Hamlet meant this. No, I think he meant that. And appeal to the meanings. And when we're actually doing science. I don't know what you think about that, Michael, but.
Well, I see we got a bunch of questions, so I'm just gonna.
I might jump in real fast.
Sam has a question.
If that's okay. I want to defend myself from the one very clear and I felt rhetorically successful rebuttal that Jason had against my low-hanging fruit metaphor. So I obviously wasn't talking about sort of whether the people you were citing were important or worked at good universities or not. What I meant, and I want to clarify, was that to me, there's a very easy critique of social science that actually, from my anecdotal understandings of natural scientists, is very common in natural sciences, which is all social science is pseudoscience, because, forgive my camera, all social science can't exist within the analogy it's trying to make for itself between itself and the natural sciences. So the social phenomena cannot be natural phenomena. This is a bridge that can't be a bridge that can't be made between the two. Now, what's interesting to me about this, especially when you go into the sort of intellectual tradition of that kind of, Prussian German Romanticism, is that the people who made up those ideas tended to be philosophers who were fluent in the natural sciences and philosophy and literature and theology and many things. And they kind of built the reality that then you're critiquing that's been built in a way. And I wonder if there's an answer here where it's not so much a literary or interpretive humanities, but just a kind of a return to that old Aristotelian sense of science, which is just kind of thinking about stuff, and whenever you need to count, you count, and whenever you need to make distinctions, you make distinctions, and whenever you need to speculate about virtues and morals, you kind of do that, and so on and so forth. Like, I wonder whether there's something almost too scientific about all these answers and specialized divisions and whatnot that are kind of performing the same. We're at some kind of like smaller layer of an onion, but we're still inside of it. The truthiness of someone like Jordan Peterson, for instance, who fortunately, it seems to no longer be a rising star of letters. But, you know, it was so easy to knock down. I was a bit disappointed that there were no lobster critique here. He could have been there, though, right? You could have had a whole
yeah.
chapter on him.
The lobsters could have been in there big time.
Yeah, totally. Like to me, actually, the issue here isn't maybe nearly as complicated. And I think the history of ideas shows us that essentially the people who came up with the maths and the logic and the naturalism and the hermeneutic interpretive stuff were largely working out of a very vague, if not scholastic, philosophical approach that that maybe our divisions of labor and our specialized academy can't quite approximate at all.
Well, in my dream academy, the social sciences would be a branch of the humanities and we'd all have training across the board. That doesn't mean dropping methods like mass surveys and so on. It just means people are trained as humanists, historically, culturally, and so on. So I quite agree with the reconfiguration. I do hear a deeper skepticism, and Sam and I have had a number of exchanges, and I always appreciate that. I might be wrong about this, and I want to pass on to the questions. So fortunately, I filibuster here, but I would just say briefly, I hear more skepticism on your side toward the possibility of a social science, whereas I think there can be an interpretive social science, a humanistic social science. So I don't think the facticity, I'm not with like Foucault, I'm not saying you are per se, Sam, but like this idea that all facticity in the human sciences is problematic. My example of like Boulder County, Colorado tends to vote Democrat. I'm not post-fact on that issue. And in fact, there are millions of facts that social scientists need to help us with the latest
pre-fact
survey.
on that issue.
What's that?
Any idiot can come up with that. That's a pre-fact. Normal
No,
people can
it's
find those
extremely
things
hard
out.
It's
Not
extremely
necessarily.
hard
Just
to
walk
come up
around and
with.
talk to lots of people and come up and count.
Well, if
as
you want to
walk.
come up with an opinion survey of like what most people think about issue X, that's really hard to do, to build a good survey, to et cetera. Now, the problem is if you atomize the meanings, you try to make scientific predictions off them and so on. But like the survey itself is extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable to know how many people own firearms in the United States without having to ask every single individual. Like that itself is a method that is very important for the social sciences.
Why is it valuable?
Well, it's extremely, imagine if we had social policy, but we couldn't.
I should make clear, like behind my question is, I assume the answer is because we're going to make predictions and judgments based on the fact, which seems like what you don't want to do. So.
Okay, so I should be clear that I think that the kind of clairvoyance we have in the social sciences is narrative. So it's like if you and I say, let's meet in Chicago in 1 year on corner, we can have a high degree of prediction on April 1st, et cetera. But that's not the same kind of prediction as in the natural sciences where it's causally mechanistic and impersonal. So I do think we're going after clairvoyance. I would want to replace that with like, or I'd want to make a philosophical distinction between strong and weak prediction. I think it's mission impossible in the social sciences to ever have strong prediction like I have about brute objects, because humans are creative, rational agents that can kind of confute us on that. Jeff, we should let some people in the questions through, right?
Great, yes. We've had a few questions come in. First is, you argue that the social sciences have shaped us in problematic ways, presumably through the stories they tell. Do you object to unifying stories or to the particular story that the social sciences tell? If it is the latter, what are the stories that should shape us?
I don't think the social sciences tell any one unified story. Obviously, in the book, I think a lot of the stories that come out of it are very bad. But a more general remark would be that it's just repressed story. You know, I think because of the influence of what I'm calling naturalism, people think of stories as kind of a prehistoric form of knowledge that's not scientific enough. If I tell you the best thing we have in social science is the best story, which is in fact what I hold, that doesn't sound scientific enough. People want a law, right? They want some kind of mechanistic prediction. And so my issue with the social sciences, and what I tried to do in the book, is just turn the tables and just read it as repressed narratives and stories. So if you look in there, I picked the bad stories. They're very good stories. There are all kinds of social scientists I learned a ton from. I quote them too. Robert Bella, the sociologist at Berkeley, tremendous sociologist. Philip Cushman, a psychologist, I think is just incredible. He's in there. So I think that we're always telling stories. And even when we don't think we're telling stories, we're telling a kind of story. When I say white and working class tends to mean vote Republican, there's a repressed story there. There's a repressed hermeneutics. And what we all need to do is be more open about our stories and then debate the stories we're telling. Are they the good story, the right story, the story that helps us understand and be clairvoyant?
We've had another question come in. How do social scientists doing, quote, good social science control who uses their work and how they use it? Not many folks are reading academic journals or books, and then parentheses, sorry, Jason, that discusses the scope, conditions, and faults with their work. Many are engaging with the media's interpretation of the good work. How much of this is just a media story?
That's like Sam in the other direction, you know, it's like you're going after the high hanging people and like you need to go just after the low fruit. And I guess I kind of want to go after both because what I think is the baleful effect is the effect of philosophical naturalism. Now, is it even worse in the public square? And is Sam right to sort of point out like, yeah, you're going after the real sloppy people? Yes. But the reason I'm going after the sloppy people, I distinguish myself from Foucault because I'm not a Foucauldian. But one thing I really learned from Foucault that I think is very valuable is the human sciences are practices. They're not just ideational. And the whole sort of Hegelian ideational view of history misses the way that we live out our theories and practices on ourselves. And that's what concerns me is it's not so much that it's in the newspaper or that it's popular, it's that it's generating a kind of self that can be manipulative and that can be deaf to certain things. The chapters that Michael mentioned on artificial intelligence and dating, I'm concerned about how we treat each other a lot of times. As a humanist, I'm concerned that we degrade each other through these technocratic modes.
And we have one final question that I think we have time for. It's a long one, so I'm going to try to read it quickly. The question is, I wonder about the internal composition of Poli-Sci departments. Unlike education departments, where this questioner is now, Poli-Sci departments typically are carved into subfields: political economics, the study of domestic politics, comparative politics, etc. The political philosophers tend to be left to their own devices in the department, much the same way as education departments. And here's the question. Do you think the erosion of teaching the foundations in humanities has left a vacuum in other departments that used to rely on outside departments equipping their students in basic history, literature, philosophy, etc.?
Yes. That's a short answer is yes, absolutely. And I think that if you start viewing the world through hermeneutics, you'll see that, to Sam's point, that there would be a real deep reorganization of the human sciences. And we wouldn't be so siloed off because it might be helpful to have some of the methods. I was making a sort of inadequate plea there for the methods of the social sciences housed within the humanities and our understanding of sort of historical narrative. I do think, I'll say this. In political science, we tend to basically break into methods groups, like they're qualitative methods and they're quantitative methods. And I think that's the wrong way to break up. I mean, you could already hear that in my earlier comment. I think mass quantitative surveys are extremely useful as long as you don't veer into naturalism with them. And I think small scale ethnographies, qualitative stuff is very useful. They answer different kinds of questions. The real issue is, are the methods being plugged into a version of explanation that is historically aware, that is narrative, and that takes human agency seriously. And my worry is that if I were king, you know, of academe, I would ask that political scientists study philosophy and history and not just get socialized in graduate school into methods wizardry and think that philosophy is resolved by getting really good at a method. I think that's a mistake. I think a lot of people are really good at method and haven't really studied the underlying philosophical issues. And I would put in a plea in that sense for people coming out of education departments, political philosophy, law school, where a humanistic interpretive form of understanding is there on the table. Not to conscript these guys into my camp, because my camp is very tendentious and not a comfy place to be. But one of the reasons that I find it so useful to have dialogue with Michael and with Sam is they're really smart humanists. I mean, look at the questions they asked me. They got at the philosophical issues underlying. And I think that's a really important form of knowledge that's been neglected.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. As promised, I'm going to share the link for our audience to register for their chance to win one of the 2 autographed copies of the book. But Sam, Michael, do you have any final thoughts? And then we can turn it over to Jason if he has a final response.
I just want to say that methods wizardry is the phrase I'm taking home. No question about that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I think methodology is a huge issue, and I would say that I think it's really important to continue to have a critical dialogue about the social sciences that actually is willing to put some skin on the table. I think from all 3 of us, there are serious consequences to what would happen if someone took up any one of these slightly different, but I think sympathetic approaches. And I think what's missing within the social sciences is oftentimes this ability to flirt with one's own destruction, which, if philosophy has any merit at all, it's that its entire tradition has been destructive. It's constantly trying to do away with itself, end the history of philosophy, blah, blah, blah. And I think that what Jason's doing here really models that kind of risk-taking theorizing. And I think there's a lot of value to that, and it's rare.
Thank you, Sam. That's a great last word on what you said about philosophy.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you, Jason, for sharing your wisdom. And again, look forward to hopefully seeing you all at the next library's sponsored event. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Michael.